how do you eliminate the risk of being surprised in job interviews? Let me explain how most candidates prepare, that is, answering as many interview questions as possible. The problem with this approach is that there's an infinite number of possible questions with new questions coming up every day. So then it means that if you prepare an infinite number of questions, in order to minimize your risk, you must make that number of questions more finite. And you do this by linking your questions with behaviors. There's only a finite number of core behaviors which are relevant to job interviews. So if you prepare on those behaviors which are finite, then you would minimize the risk of getting surprised in these job interviews. How do you prepare on behaviors for job interviews? Well, this is the concept of preparing a story bank, which should role play. Right, so let's start with the story bank. If you prepare a story bank on core behaviors, what I noticed, and I do this since 2018, is that still candidates struggle coming up. 95% of candidates fail building a story bank that's good enough by their own standards, simply because there's a good number of behaviors. If you only think about Amazon's 16 leadership principles, there's other models of behavioral competencies which are usually built by employers to serve their internal needs. So then the fix here is I came up with the model of simplified behavioral competencies based on, most commonly asked types of questions, and others, based on my experience working with various candidates. And I managed to bring down this list to something that I call a manageable endeavor, right? The training is only 3 hours, but you can also come up with your own list of behavioral competencies to prepare for. And this is how you would limit the amount of time you'll spend on preparing on those finite number of behaviors, right? So the second challenge in answering these interview questions, even if they are behaviors, is to understand, to spot the behavior behind the question. So in order to improve your skill of spotting the behaviors from the questions you're asked, you would have to role play them or to build your listening skills, right? So long story short, what you must focus on is to build a story bank and to role play it in order to minimize your risk of getting surprised in these job interviews. Does this work? I'm doing this since 2019, and I can tell you from my experience that the moment candidates start thinking this way, from this mentality of answering as many questions as possible versus preparing a story bank and your role play, your standards will change. And actually, the right question in a behavioral interview is not on whether you're going to get surprised or not. This is not where the bar is. People who get stuck, you shouldn't necessarily be afraid of getting stuck, but rather you should worry about coming up with the best possible stories, always. And once you understand where the bar is in these behavioral interviews, you'll never be afraid again of getting stuck in these behavioral interviews. Just as a quick note here, I have more than a few candidates who did actually get stuck in behavioral interviews, and then they got up-leveled simply because they employed this approach of building a story bank and role play, which is the golden standard of preparing behavioral interviews. And just as a closing tip here, try to interview slowly, because interviewing slowly will also ensure that you will not fall into traps such as trick questions in these job interviews. And more importantly, it will always ensure that you give your best story.